The Queen Elizabeth II, flagship of the historic Cunard line. The QE2 is the largest passenger ship afloat. Bristling with the most advanced technology and capable of a speed of 34 knots, she is the fastest ocean liner in the world. In these days of fast jet passenger aircraft, speed can no longer be any reason for choosing to travel by ocean liner. The thousands of passengers who sail on the QE2 every year do so not because they must get from one place to another in the shortest possible time, but rather to savor some echo of the romance and glamour of a bygone age. In the course of 1.5 centuries, the ocean liner has become the symbol of a way of life incomparably luxurious and exclusive. Even the very names of the great liners of the past still have the power to at once evoke the most vivid images of a glittering world now vanished. France, Mauritania, the United States, Normandy, the Queen Mary, and the QE2's illustrious predecessor, the Queen Elizabeth. All have become bywords for leisured wealth and sumptuous grandeur. In its heyday, the first-class passage on an ocean liner was the ultimate status symbol. Anyone who was anyone was as much at home in the staterooms of the great ships as in the most fashionable clubs or restaurants in London, Paris, or New York. Ironically, the origins of this, the most elegant and comfortable means of transport imaginable, lie in a technology once seen as the noisiest, most unreliable, and altogether most unsavory method of propulsion ever devised: the steam engine. As steam dramatically transformed transportation on land, so it quickly revolutionized the maritime world. In 1812, Europe's first commercial paddle steamer, the Comet, had been operating on Scotland's River Clyde. Within 4 years, the steamer had broken free of the confines of estuary and coastal waters, and there were 3 scheduled passenger services across the Irish Sea. Almost twice as fast as the sailing packets, the paddle steamers were a sensation. They were also extremely profitable for their operators. So much so that the number of lines and ships multiplied at an astonishing rate. In 1828 alone, 80 new steamships were registered at Lloyd's. Soon, there were simply too many steamers. On the busiest and most profitable routes, those between Britain and Ireland, a full-scale price war broke out between rival steamship companies. One operator reduced the first-class fare to 2 shillings and carried deck passengers for free. Another offered a 3-penny deck fare with free meat and bread. Not surprisingly, many companies went bankrupt. By the early 1830s, surviving operators had realized that the market was saturated. The question for the visionaries of steam power was, where next? The obvious answer was the Atlantic Ocean. The passenger of today, crossing the Atlantic on the QE2, could well find it hard to imagine the challenge facing the pioneers of ocean steamships. A vessel of almost 66,000 tons is as near immune to the vagaries of the weather as it is possible for a ship to be. Sophisticated satellite navigational aids and powerful radar allow the ship's position to be pinpointed with amazing accuracy. At a stroke, almost eliminating one of the greatest dangers faced by any vessel, losing its way in heavy weather and finding itself on the rocks of an unseen shore. Yet, by the mid-1830s, there was no shortage of men determined, in spite of the risks, to bring ocean travel into the age of steam. The most eminent was the Scottish engineering genius Isambard Kingdom Brunel. It is said that in 1835, at a meeting of the board of the Great Western Railway, Brunel, the company's chief engineer, jokingly suggested extending the London to Bristol line to New York. It was the germ of an idea that culminated in the building of the 1,340-ton Great Western, the world's first purpose-built ocean liner. A rival to the Great Western had at the same time been commissioned by the British and American Steam Navigation Company. And although progress on the new ship had been delayed by a series of misfortunes, they were determined to be the first to cross the Atlantic by steam. In a bold and historic move, the company decided to charter a vessel for the attempt. The only ship with even the remotest chance of success was the St. George Steam Packet Company's 703-ton Sirius, then plying the humble route from Cork to London. The ex-naval lieutenant appointed as captain of the Sirius, Richard Roberts, was perfectly well aware of the extraordinary danger of attempting an Atlantic crossing in such a tiny ship. But Roberts was a man who had said of himself, "I would go to sea in a washing tub." At 10 a.m. on the morning of April the 4th, 1838, the Sirius steamed from Passage West near the Irish port of Cork. She was laden far beyond anything she was designed to bear. 453 tons of coal instead of her usual 90, 58 barrels of resin, and 20 tons of fresh water. She also carried 40 pioneering passengers. 4 days later, her giant rival, the Great Western, set out in hot pursuit. The Sirius had run head-on into heavy gales, and in any case could make only 6 or 7 knots against the Great Western's 9. But down to her last 15 tons of coal, on April the 22nd, the Sirius sighted the American coast, and at 10 p.m. anchored off the New York battery. The crossing had taken 18 days and 10 hours. The Great Western arrived the following day, but it was the Sirius and her dashing young captain Richard Roberts who were the heroes of the hour. Against the most daunting odds, they had ushered in the age of the transatlantic liner. Within 6 months of the epoch-making voyage of the Sirius, steamships were regularly crossing the North Atlantic, and no less than 3 shipping lines had established scheduled services between Britain and America. Nevertheless, the uncomfortable fact was that the transatlantic passenger trade was simply not a commercial proposition. Prospective passengers could not be convinced of the steamship's safety, and little wonder. In the 5 years to 1848, 14 steamers were lost on transatlantic voyages. Captain Dick Roberts himself had drowned in 1841 when his Third Atlantic Command, the President, with 136 people on board, went down in a gale. That the Atlantic liner had a viable future beyond the 1840s was due, above all, to the vision of a shipowner whose famous line continues to sail to this day. Samuel Cunard, founder of the Cunard Steamship Company of Liverpool, insisted that the safety of his passengers should be placed above every other consideration. Speed was to take second place. Cunard instructed his captains, "Your ship is loaded, take her. Speed is nothing. Follow your own road. Deliver her safe, bring her back safe." Safety is all that is required. The Cunard name soon became a byword for reliability and punctuality. And slowly, the attitude of the traveling public towards the ocean steamer began to change. Even though speed was not Cunard's priority, his first Atlantic steamer, the Britannia, which had first crossed the ocean in July 1840, soon captured the record for the east to west Atlantic crossing that would become known as the Blue Riband. The publicity, along with a lucrative contract with Royal Mail, secured the future of Cunard's line. Because Cunard was interested above all in safety and reliability, he was deliberately slow to introduce risky technical innovations. Experiments with the iron hull, the screw propeller, and the compound engine he left to others, only adopting them as they were tried and tested. He was equally reluctant to invest large sums in luxurious accommodation for his passengers. In this, Cunard would be proved correct. In the 1850s, the Atlantic passenger trade began to change out of all recognition. Millions of Europeans were determined to escape poverty, revolution and war to a new life in the land of opportunity. With the ever-increasing demand for cheap Atlantic travel, the operators of steamships companies could, for the first time, expect to make profits without a mail contract. One result was the decision by the owners of Brunel's masterpiece of engineering, the Great Eastern, to deploy her on the Atlantic rather than the route to Australia for which she'd been designed. At 18,900 tons, 5 times larger than any vessel then in existence, and driven by paddles and propeller, the Great Eastern was the embodiment of an important principle discovered by Brunel. As the length of a ship is cubed, the power required to drive it is only squared. In other words, for long-haul vessels, the larger the ship, the better. The Great Eastern, launched in 1859, although never a commercial success, was the true forerunner of the superliner. The first shipping company to prosper due to the surge in transatlantic emigration was the British Inman Line. Inman's City of New York, launched in 1888, was a classic liner of her day. And her sister ship, the City of Rome, the first three-funnel ship ever built, was acknowledged as perhaps the most beautiful vessel yet to cross the Atlantic. In the late 1890s, the dominance of British lines on the Atlantic was facing its first serious challenge. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany was determined that his country should be second to none in any sphere. The building of great ocean liners in German yards would be a clear demonstration of his nation's growing industrial might. Just as important, the Kaiser saw that in time of war, liners could easily be converted into armed cruisers. The first of Germany's new breed of superliners was the Kaiser Wilhelm de Gross of the North German Lloyd Company, launched in 1897. At 14,350 tons, the vessel was the largest and fastest in the world. The second major German shipping line to compete in the North Atlantic was the Hamburg America Company. Hamburg America's first superliner was the Deutschland of 16,502 tons, launched in 1900. The Deutschland set a new standard in first-class passenger accommodation and would hold the Atlantic record for 6 years running. The British response to the German challenge culminated in 1907 with the Lusitania of 31,550 tons and the Mauretania of 31,938 tons. Both ships could make Atlantic crossings of under 5 days, and Britain was once again in possession of the world's biggest and fastest. Mauretania, seen here in later life, would remain unchallenged holder of the blue riband for the fastest Atlantic crossing until 1929, a reign of fully 22 years. It would be 1935 before she finally went to the scrapyard. The White Star Line followed Cunard's lead with two even larger vessels. The first was the Olympic of 45,324 tons, launched in 1910. At 882.5 feet long, it was White Star's proud boast that the Olympic's length exceeded the height of the world's tallest buildings. She was also the last word in luxury, and was meant to be rivaled only by her sister ship, the ill-fated Titanic. Like the Olympic and other White Star ships before her, the Titanic was built by the Harland and Wolff Company of Belfast. So enormous were the new liners that special slipways and a towering gantry, the largest ever, had to be built to accommodate them. Everything about these vessels was on a gigantic scale. Their hulls were made of inch-thick steel plate, fastened by 2 million rivets. The ships were powered by 3 engines, with 159 furnaces and 29 boilers. White Star's intention was to carry passengers across the Atlantic with the speed and certainty of an express train. The Titanic was launched on May the 31st, 1911, 7 months after the Olympic, and she was completed in March 1912. Her maiden voyage from Southampton to New York was scheduled for April the 10th. Like her sister ship, the Titanic could accommodate 2,345 passengers, 689 in first class, and the rest divided into second and third. For her first-class passengers, the ship offered luxury beyond anything yet seen in a liner. She was the pinnacle of Edwardian elegance and sophistication. First-class suites in Empire or Regency style. Staterooms in Jacobean taste or in the mood of the Renaissance. And a veranda cafe with a hint of the East were all designed to attract the wealthiest and most discerning passengers. White Star could even boast that the paneling of the vessel's smoking room was fashioned out of a single enormous tree. While the Titanic's magnificent dining saloon was a showpiece capable of serving 500 diners simultaneously, most of her complement of first-class passengers, the focal point of the first-class passenger accommodation was the Titanic's strikingly elegant William and Mary grand staircase. It was with supreme confidence that on April 10, 1912, the Titanic set out on her maiden voyage to New York. With her 16 watertight compartments, she was widely believed to be unsinkable. Yet, on the night of Sunday, April the 14th, after striking an iceberg, the Titanic went down, taking with her more than 1,500 of her 2,227 passengers and crew. It was a disaster at sea on an unprecedented scale. And so shocking was the loss that many came to believe that in constructing such wonders of technology, man had simply overreached himself. In the wake of the Titanic disaster, the fortunes of the White Star Line would never fully recover. As for the Cunard Line, its superliners Lusitania and Mauretania were followed in 1914 by a third sister ship, the Aquitania, widely regarded as the most beautiful liner yet built. But even the Aquitania's splendor was outclassed by Hamburg America's new giant, the 52,000-ton Imperator. Imperator was to be the most luxurious liner ever to take to sea. The Winter Garden, part of the Ritz-Carlton Grill. The social hall, where first-class passengers could gather to gossip over tea. The panelled smoking room, a gentleman's club as exclusive as any on land. The swimming pool, modelled on the Roman remains at Pompeii, splendid with marble columns in its own balcony. The ship even had elevators. With the outbreak of the Great War in 1914, many hoped that commercial sailings of passenger liners could continue in spite of hostilities, if all parties agreed. One ship that continued sailing was the Lusitania, but on May 7, 1915, she was torpedoed and sunk by a German submarine. The Lusitania took only 18 minutes to go to the bottom, and almost 1,200 people died. For ocean liners, it was the turning point of the war. Almost all were now either laid up or converted for use as auxiliaries. The Mauretania became for a short time an armed merchant cruiser, but she proved far more suitable first as a troop ship and then as a hospital ship, in which role she served in the Gallipoli campaign. The Aquitania, too, was deployed as a hospital ship in 1915, ferrying wounded soldiers from the Dardanelles landings. The Great War took a heavy toll of the world's liners, and for those that survived, the year immediately following the end of hostilities was taken up returning Allied troops to their home countries. It would be more than a decade before a new large liner would enter service. But meanwhile, there were major changes in the world of passenger shipping. As part of war reparations, Germany's greatest ships were handed over to Britain, America, and France. Notably, the Hamburg-America Line's Imperator became Cunard's flagship, the Berengaria. The Berengaria would continue to serve on the Atlantic route until 1938. White Star, too, shared in the spoils of war, buying from the British government the Imperator's larger sister ship, the Bismarck, which became the Majestic, the largest liner afloat until 1933. It was the tightening of American immigration laws from 1921 that produced the next major change in transatlantic passenger services. The imposition of limits on the numbers of people allowed to enter the United States dramatically reduced the steerage and third-class passenger market. As a result, steerage was gradually abolished, and an improved third class introduced instead, intended for budget-minded tourists. At the same time, more and more of the middle classes were now discovering that the ocean liner offered a unique kind of holiday. With the ocean-going tourist came the cruise, the chance to see and experience places up to now almost inaccessible to any but the hardiest or wealthiest traveler. Here in 1920, passengers on the British cruise ship Arcadian are amongst the earliest cruise tourists to visit the Canary Islands. First port of call is Santa Cruz, the capital of Tenerife, then a drive across the island to Porto Ortava. Much of the charm of cruising in these early days is the knowledge that so many destinations have been as yet untouched by the tide of progress. The few cruise liners to call are very welcome to the local economy, but their impact on the way of life of local inhabitants is minimal. And for passengers, there is a sense of adventure, which, in only a few decades, will have virtually disappeared. By now, the impromptu and self-made entertainment traditional on board a liner, the concert parties and card games, has given way to more organized activities. The purpose, of course, is to dispel boredom, the eternal bane of travel by sea. While the short cruise made sailing by liner a realizable dream for a much wider cross-section of the population, the owners of the great shipping lines, although delighted with this new development, were still reluctant to commit themselves to building new ships in such unsettled times. It was 1927 before the world's next great liner was launched. The French line's Île-de-France was neither the biggest nor the fastest liner afloat, but in terms of her decor, she was revolutionary. The style of the Ile-de-France was like nothing that could be found on shore. Refusing merely to copy the great hotels of the world, her designers had developed a totally new concept. The liner Art Deco of the Ile-de-France would soon itself become the model for the finest hotels and restaurants of the world's most fashionable cities. While the French concentrated on fashion and style, the German lines were once more aspiring to the fastest and the most advanced. The Bremen and the Europa, both of over 50,000 tons, were launched in August 1928. Driven by the most powerful steam turbines yet built, the ships would quickly win the blue ribbon for Germany, and in the process prove themselves two of the finest superliners of all time. By the end of the 1920s, the days of the simple steam engine were drawing to a close. Steam turbo-electric propulsion was smooth, powerful, and economic. Amongst the earliest vessels to be powered by the new technology was the Monarch of Bermuda and her sister ship, the Queen, operated by the British Furness Bermuda Line. The ships earned tremendous profits, offering 6-day cruises to the Bahamas from New York on what became known as the Millionaire's Run. In fact, a cabin with its own facilities could cost as little as $50 a cruise. And these ships perhaps did more than any others to popularize the idea of ocean cruising amongst the less than wealthy. In the early 1930s, with only the cruise market booming, and with few Atlantic liners able to make a profit, the lure of the blue riband, still held by the Bremen, was, if anything, stronger than ever. National pride was at stake, and in 1932, Mussolini's Italy joined the race with the Rex, a vessel purposely built for speed. Italy's hopes were justified. In 1933, Rex captured the blue riband with an average speed of an amazing 28.9 knots. Italy's success spurred France onto greater efforts. The French line's Normandy was intended not just to uphold France's reputation for stylish and fashionable liners, but to be the largest and fastest passenger ship ever built. The Normandy, completed in May 1935, was the first liner of more than 1,000 feet in length. She was also intended to be the biggest, at over 79,000 tons. The Normandy more than justified French confidence in her speed. In April 1935, she snatched the blue ribbon from the Italians, making the Atlantic crossing in 4 days, 3 hours, and 2 minutes. The most lavish liner of her time, the Normandy was a floating ambassador for French design. Her main restaurant was of bronze and hammered glass and could seat 1,000 people. The smoking room was paneled in lacquer with gilt overlays. Her main lounge was 110 feet long and was the height of 2 decks. The winter garden even had real birds in ornate cages, whilst amongst her first-class suites were 2 penthouses with their own private sun decks. To cure a vibration problem, Normandy was extensively modified in late 1935, and the addition at the same time of extra cabins and a sun deck aft pushed her to 83,423 tons. The extra tonnage ensured that the Normandy would be the largest liner afloat until 1940. In 1942, Normandy met a tragic and unnecessary end. While being converted to an American troopship, sparks from a welder's torch started a fire, and there was no firefighting equipment on board. The thousands of tons of water then pumped into the stricken ship by the New York Fire Brigade completed the disaster. In the early morning of February the 10th, Normandy rolled over at her berth. One of the most magnificent ocean liners ever built had, in the space of a few short hours, been doomed to the scrapyard. Britain's Cunard line had begun to plan for its own new generation of superliners as early as 1926. In May 1930, an order was placed with the John Brown Company of Clydebank for a giant liner known as yet only as Hull 534. Due to the uncertainties of the Depression, work on 534 was abandoned in December 1931. It was the intervention of the Prince of Wales and a plan to amalgamate Cunard and White Star that finally persuaded the government to step in with a loan so that work on the new liner could continue. Hull 534 was finally launched on September the 16th, 1934. She was named the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary was completed on April the 15th, 1936, and by August she'd already captured her first record for Cunard White Star by making the west to east Atlantic crossing at an average speed of 30.14 knots. It was on her return voyage to New York that the Queen Mary captured the blue ribbon for Britain. She had averaged 30.6 knots and became the first ship to cross the Atlantic in under 4 days. The Queen Mary was a truly stunning feat of maritime engineering. Over 80,000 tons and more than 1,000 feet long, her construction had used over 10 million rivets. She had 2,000 portholes and 2,500 square feet of glass. Her vast interiors included the largest apartment ever built inside a ship, her sea deck restaurant, 143 feet long and 118 feet wide. As the Queen Mary and the Normandy vied with each other for the blue ribbon and the coveted record alternated between France and Britain, the Queen Mary was the only superliner on the transatlantic run to make a profit. The increasing prosperity of the mid-1930s was not reflected in the transatlantic trade, but more than ever in the much more democratic world of the cruise liner. The range of cruises now available to the public and the number of liners spending at least part of their year on the cruise circuit was greater than ever. From a 4-day jaunt to the nearest sun-soaked islands, to a month-long voyage around the Mediterranean, Africa, South America, or the Middle East, there are cruises to suit every pocket. Onboard entertainment ranges from simple deck games to full dance bands. But whether aboard one of the world's great superliners or a more modest cruise ship, the spirit is the same. Everyone has one object in mind: to wrest as much enjoyment as possible out of an all too brief interlude. Not all cruise ships of the 1930s have been built with the innocent purpose of giving pleasure to passengers and making profits for their owners. Since the turn of the century, governments had seen the liner as a potentially useful addition to their wartime navies. And now, in Adolf Hitler's Germany, a dramatic increase in tourist cruising is not what it seems. Ostensibly, the Strength Through Joy movement, the largest leisure organization in the world, is devoted to providing ordinary German working people with facilities they would otherwise never enjoy. In 1938, 180,000 Germans go on cruises. The organization serves its purpose in creating a sense of prosperity and of gratitude to the Nazi regime. But the Strength Through Joy cruise ships have been built with another role in mind. They are perfectly suited for service as military transports. During the Spanish Civil War, the German Condor Legion sailed to support Franco's fascists in liners of the Strength Through Joy fleet, disguised as a tourist cruise. The Cunard White Star Line had planned for a second superliner on the Atlantic route to complement the Queen Mary. The outbreak of the Second World War changed everything. The Queen Mary's new consort, the Queen Elizabeth, made her maiden voyage to New York in 1940, not as a commercial passenger liner, but as a potential troop ship. It was the Queen Mary that first sailed in this new role. In May 1940, ferrying 5,000 Australian soldiers to Britain as part of what came to be known as the multi-million-dollar convoy US-3. US-3 included no fewer than 6 luxury liners, the largest number ever to sail together. During the course of the war, the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth between them carried 1,243,538 Allied soldiers. The Queen Mary has the record for the greatest number of troops ever carried on a single voyage, 16,683 men. So valuable was the contribution of the Queens that Adolf Hitler offered a reward of $250,000 to the U-boat commander who could sink either ship. And Allied leaders estimated that the Queens shortened the war in Europe by at least a full year. With the end of the Second World War and renewed prosperity, there was an upsurge in transatlantic travel that lasted almost a decade. The ritual competition for the Blue Riband continued, with the record being held by the Queen Mary. At the same time, the distinction of being the largest liner afloat was held by the Queen Elizabeth. Germany, Italy and France were for the time being all but out of the race. It was the Americans, perhaps because of their new self-confidence as a superpower, but also with an eye to the proven importance of liners as troop ships, that built the greatest passenger vessel of the post-war era. The United States, although only 53,000 tons, was the most technologically advanced superliner in the world. She was also the fastest, and on July the 6th, 1952, snatched the Blue Riband from the Queen Mary, reaching a top speed of over 38 knots. Only 6 years after the maiden voyage of the United States, the first commercial jet airliners were crossing the Atlantic. Within months, airlines had captured 2/3 of the transatlantic passenger trade. For the shipping lines, it was a disaster. It seemed that the end of the ocean liner was in sight. While the Atlantic trade foundered, liners plying from Britain to Australia would prove slower to be affected by the upsurge in air traffic. In 1954, the British P&O Line had commissioned the sister ships Arcadia and Iberia, each of 29,664 tons, for the Australian route, and for a while the ships were profitable. But by the end of the 1950s, profits depended more and more on seasonal cruising, the one service with which the aeroplane could not compete. The Arcadia, unlike her sister ship, happily survived the transition from liner service to cruiser. Arcadia's tourist class accommodation is basic, yet the ship does provide air conditioning and every cabin has its own hot and cold water. Later, the Arcadia will be converted to a one-class ship, part of a trend that will continue until one-class cruising becomes the norm. Here, the Arcadia steams south across the Bay of Biscay at the beginning of a 3-week cruise. First port of call is the Portuguese capital, Lisbon. A day for sightseeing and souvenir hunting, and then, in the wake of by now hundreds of cruise ships before her, to Madeira. Even now, a far cry from the sleepy island it was in the days before the cruise liner. Nevertheless, with airline package holidays still in the future, much of Madeira's old world charm does remain. Leaving Madeira behind, the Arcadia heads for the gateway to the Mediterranean, Gibraltar. A home to the Royal Navy for centuries, but as yet hardly visited by tourists. The graveyard where the dead of the Battle of Trafalgar are buried is high on the itinerary. Last port of call on the Iberian Peninsula is Malaga. Passengers go ashore by launch and find a traditional Mediterranean town with hardly an apartment block in sight. As the Arcadia heads east towards Italy, passengers happily accustom themselves to days of blue sea and sunshine. The scenes on deck as people enter into the traditional games with a will could just as easily come from a cruise liner of 3 decades earlier. Via Rome and Naples, the Arcadia heads for Messina in Sicily. Here, the attraction is day-long excursions around the Sicilian coast and visits to classical sites, a high point for Mediterranean cruises since their earliest days. It is the sheer variety of destinations that can be encompassed in a single holiday that will, in the end, guarantee the future of the cruise liner. Throughout the 1960s and beyond, standards of accommodation will rise and the range of cruises offered by operators will multiply. But the essence of the cruise's attraction will remain the same. Exotic places, the complete absence of hurry and bustle, and perhaps above all, the magic of the liner itself. Even in the 1960s, with the dominance of the jet aircraft an established fact, the day of the transatlantic liner was not yet over. Remarkably, considering that there was little hope that they could ever justify their massive cost, some new liners were built. The Italian Michelangelo of 45,000 tons launched in 1962, and her sister ship Raffaello were stylish and unusual designs. But, predictably, they quickly lost their operators vast sums of money. In 1962, the last superliner built solely for the North Atlantic, the magnificent 66,000-ton France, arrived in New York for the first time. At 1,035 feet, she was the longest liner ever built. And it is a tribute to her high standards of service that, for a while at least, she attracted almost as much attention and as many celebrity passengers as she might have expected in the heyday of the 1930s. Nevertheless, the France was the last of her breed. Perhaps appropriately, the future belonged to Cunard, the oldest surviving name in the history of transatlantic liners. The intention behind the design of the Queen Elizabeth II, launched on September the 20th, 1967, was not to produce an Atlantic record breaker. Nor at 65,863 tons was she to be as large as her Queen predecessors. Instead, she was to be a dual-purpose liner, fast enough to make the Atlantic crossing in good time, but sufficiently economical to profitably cruise the winter months. With the QE2, the days of the strictly class-divided and stylistically reserved British liner disappeared forever. She was an entirely new concept, designed in the most modern taste. Instead of wood-paneled libraries and elegant salons, she is a space-age world of plastic, glass and metal, owing more to Las Vegas than to any gentleman's club of the 19th century. The QE2's early days of operation were plagued by problems with her steam turbines and by financial difficulties for her owner, Cunard. The turning point came in 1986, 4 years after she'd followed the example of previous queens by serving as a troopship in the Falklands War. With the cruise market still growing, and with the retirement of all her rivals on the North Atlantic, Cunard and its parent company, Trafalgar House, opted for a courageous and almost unprecedented course of action. The QE2's steam turbines were removed in a complex and costly operation and replaced by the first diesel-electric drives ever fitted to a transatlantic liner. The new motors powered the ship via 2 variable pitch propellers, making for tremendous efficiency and superb responsiveness. The QE2's 9 diesel engines deliver 130,000 horsepower to her 2 350-ton, 44-megawatt motors. She can maintain full electric power on board and maintain a speed of 28.5 knots, even with 3 engines shut down. With all 9 running, she can reach 34 knots. As the last transatlantic liner, the Queen Elizabeth II has seen an unexpected rise in the numbers of passengers wishing to cross the Atlantic by sea. It is a remarkable reversal of a trend that had seemed set only 2 decades ago to relegate the Atlantic passenger liner to the pages of history. The QE2 is now very likely to sail well into the next century. Perhaps the attraction is nostalgia. perhaps it is the leisurely pace of ocean travel and the ship's flawless service. Or perhaps for those with money and time, the congested airports of the modern age can never be an adequate substitute for the most majestic and stately means of transportation that man has ever devised.